Assalamu alaikum. Today this is the second lecture for our subject called Applied Quantitative Analysis and Practices. Previously we have been discussing about what this course was about, what were the contents of this course, and in this case it is pertinent to mention that what's the history behind this subject, what was the main use because of which we had to focus on this subject in this case. So we know very well that the history behind this whole subject is that previously all the industrialists used to measure the workforce productivity in terms of number of hours a worker used to work in the industry, and their focus was in this case was only to focus on maximizing profit. But then after a certain period of time the competition started increasing, and as globalization occurred, the companies started their endeavors outside the main geographical area where they used to work. They started globalizing, and then when they started making profits outside their main arena, then they invested those profits back in the main geographical area where they started, and started beating their competitors from that profit. So it was not only about making profit then. At that time the companies had to realize that it was then vital for them that they would have to make more profit than others, because if they didn't, otherwise ultimately that company will be overtaken by their competitors. You can just have a look at the example of Polka, which used to be here in Pakistan, a very reputable company at that time. But then a very strong player from outside the country comes and suddenly acquires it. Reason behind that is that they were having more strong financial position than Polka. And another dimension of the same thing can be seen from this perspective, that you can very much see that Procter and Gamble, for example, they post, let's say hypothetically, a $60 million profit in their quarterly statement. But at the same time, there's a very small headline on the same newspaper which is stating that Procter and Gamble has fired around about 6,000 employees in their divisions. The reason behind that is that even the simple profit which they may have been making without firing those employees would not be enough to compete with the profit which their competitors were making. And if they are not competing with the profits of their competitors, then I would say that ultimately the competitors would acquire that very company. So when this thing was not limited to only maximizing profit, and the main focus of the business industry became in making more profit than others, then the typical strategy of just reducing the cost of their products and make profit was not enough. So ultimately what a company would do to reduce cost, I mean, by streamlining processes, by streamlining the workers' productivity. So in all these cases, the typical or conventional way of measuring workers' productivity and just trying to reduce the cost of raw materials or trying to get cheaper machinery, these typical conventional things were not enough in this case. So these business industries had to focus on other ways to enhance their productivity. Now, in order to do that, what they did was that they started focusing on those phenomena which were immeasurable, which could not be measured. So, in this case, in order to measure that, these so-called processes and phenomena, these phenomena were basically intangible. For example, they did realize that attitude, behaviors of the workforce, the way the workers work in the organization, these processes are of vital importance. They cannot be ignored. So in this case, this was necessary that they had to focus on that. At that time, at the same time, the business research did indicate that such kind of phenomena like organizational commitment or employee commitment towards organization, or I would say the productivity of employees in terms of their enthusiasm, their motivation towards their work, these things matter. But the problem was how to measure these things, because it's not easy to measure these phenomena conventionally through numbers. So now the business philosophers did come to know and did indicate through various theories that yes, these things are important and they do matter in increasing the productivity of overall organizational aspect. But the problem was how to measure these things. So basically in this case I would say that more focus was made in measuring these phenomena. Now, coming to this fact that first stage was to realize the importance of all these intangible factors. They knew that leadership is important. They knew attitude and behaviors now are important. They knew that motivation is important. So all these factors did make their mark in the minds of business philosophers. Now, coming to the measurement, this was a big question mark. So let's say, coming to this fact that they started realizing the importance of these phenomena, then they started making flow charts, or I would say models of their impact. For example, let's say that let's say leadership. This is one of the factors which whose importance was realized, and they made the model like leadership would have an impact on the performance of an employee. However, this individual performance then ultimately would result in better organizational performance. So by making these flow charts and these models, the researchers and the industrialists did understand their importance of these factors. But the problem was that, let's say, in case of leadership, how to measure the leadership in any organization. So in order to do that, they had to develop measures in order to measure this leadership factor. And in this case, they started developing questionnaires which would be focused on asking the employees of the organization whether what's their opinion about the leadership of that organization. And by measuring these questions through certain scales which were established. For example, I ask employee of an organization that, can you tell me that whether this your supervisor is supportive towards your goals? Can you tell me about the leadership of this organization, and take on the relative intensity. For example, they are asked to tell the intensity of their answers through a certain scale ranging from 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagreeing, 2 is agreeing, 3 is neutral, 4 is strongly agreeing, and 4 is strongly agreeing, and 5 is strongly agreeing. So in all these 5 intensity marks, they had to take on the relative importance in order to answer the question which was posed and focused upon the supportive role of their supervisor towards their goals in their specific division. So once they tick on any of these options in order to show, let's say they take on 4 to show the intensity of their agreement and disagreement towards the leadership characteristic of their supervisor in the organization, then in this case the I would say that specific leadership characteristic was then measured. We were able to measure that specific characteristic through the scale. So similarly, we measured various aspects of these leadership characteristics through various questions, and by measuring those questions through the intensity of the scales which you just saw on the screen. So once their intensity was measured and converted into numbers, then we could now compare these numbers with the relative performance. And in this case, yes, one can say that performance, in this case employee performance, can also be measured by asking the relative CEO of that company whether the individual performing in that specific division was satisfactory to him, and if it was, then to what extent. And again, in that case, we are using the same scale. So again, this is just a hypothetical example of how we are converting all these variables into scales, into numbers, and then once we have determined the numbers in this case, and we have converted their opinion into numbers, then we can measure them quantitatively. So now likewise, this whole phenomena in this case can be then compared with organizational performance in this case, which can be measured through stock market, through stock shares, or through other means. Now once you can see here, what we did was that first we derived the concept from the theory that okay, leadership can have a notable impact, I would say, in this case, on the performance of an organization, first thing. Now then, in second phase, we converted this into a model. Now once we have converted it into a model and displayed it in the screen in this model form, then the third step was how to measure them. So we developed a questionnaire and we asked the relative stakeholders about these specific variables like leadership or individual performance and organizational performance, and we saw, or we determined the intensity of those answers and converted then these intangible concepts into quantitative form. Now once we have converted these concepts into quantitative form, then the next thing was that how to analyze them. Now in this case we should not forget that once we are measuring them, and by measuring them I mean that when we are asking from the respondents or the stakeholders, in this specific case they were employees for leadership and CEOs for measuring individual performance. Once we are asking them, we are basically asking about their perception towards their leadership, or perception of a CEO towards individual performance of the employee. So basically the perception of the respondent becomes of more importance. That is why that their business research focus became on the perception of a specific policy. If a policy which we introduce in an organization is very good, but the perception of an employee towards the policy is not approving, then that policy will not work. So ultimately, you see, that policy will be folded back. So the main importance of the whole business phenomena came to the fact that what's the perception of the working class or the employees towards these policies which are introduced in the organization. So now when we are measuring the impact of these variables in an organization, then basically we are focusing on the perception of all these stakeholders. And in this phase we just focus on the models, and in all these cases what we used was modeling of all these different phenomena. We first developed them into variables and then modeling them and then converting them into quantitative form and then ultimately measuring them. Now coming to this fact, and when we are measuring all these phenomena, then the other thing which is of importance is measurement techniques, because in previous lecture what we focused on was variables, what were the types of variables, but what type of variables we were discussing about. And now I have given you a bit detail of the variables like which you have seen in this example here. And in this case you can see that this is just one example of leadership affecting performance. It can be like the success factors of a project, their impact on the project performance, first thing. Then it can be like the selection or training practices of which have been introduced in an organization by human resource division, and their impact on the organizational performance or individual performance. So we can define all these phenomena into variables. Just to give you another example, like in this case, let's say the selection practice, the way how we select an employee can have impact on the individual performance. Individual performance of the employee in an organization, which can then lead to, I would say, job satisfaction, whether the individual is satisfied with the job or not, and ultimately if he is satisfied with his job, then ultimately he can be committed, and this can impact employee commitment, I would say, in this case. So basically it's a chain reaction in which we first see the introductory phenomena in an organization and its impact on its ultimate output. So basically this whole phenomena have been converted into models, like you have seen another example here, and then we quantify them. Once we quantify them, then the problem is related to how to analyze them. So once we go through the analyzation of that phase, then we come to the details, and in these details we have discussed like what's the data and what are variables, the type of variables which we have discussed right now. Then there are various kind of variables which we discussed before, like categorical variables, nominal variables, ordinal variables, and then how to measure them and what are the measurement levels in this case. What are the sources of data in this case, from where we can get this data? Because you see, in this case, let's say we want to get the information from the respondents by using a questionnaire. So we go to the employee in an organization taking a questionnaire, and we ask the employee to answer certain questions regarding the leadership of a certain organization. So in this case, the data source is the primary data. So and likewise we can get other details regarding organizational performance, you can say related to stock market shares or stock prices, from secondary sources. So we get the detail of every variable from relative sources. They can be primary, they can be secondary as well. And then once we get them, then the problem comes to the refining of that data, because in some cases it's not necessary that the respondents who are filling the questionnaire answer each question. So that means if they are not answering each question, then that means that there would be missing data there as well. So how to treat that missing data? Whether we can assume a data value for that. If we do, whether it will be unbiased or biased. And then in this case the question becomes whether we should use that data or that specific questionnaire in which some questions have not been answered by the respondents, or we should just ignore the questionnaire in which some questions have not been answered. So coming to that thing, there are various options which we have got, and we can pursue each option. It depends upon the situation in which we are working or analyzing the data in this case. So likewise, what we discussed later in this case was related to sample, and what are the types of sampling in this case. You see, when we are observing this phenomena, as we have discussed before, let's see this, let's say we want to discuss about, or we want to observe the impact of leadership on the performance of an individual, then in this case it's not humanly possible to sometimes get the feedback from an organization comprising of 4,000 to 5,000 employees, and we get the feedback of all the employees in that organization and answer and get their answers for those specific variables. So what we have to do is that we have to sample those specific respondents, and we have to choose. We cannot cover all the respondents, so we have to choose which respondents' opinion can we take logically, and how much number is feasible for us in that specific time frame, in that specific budget. So let's say if we want to perform a study on IT sector companies, and we want to see that whether the leadership in those IT sector companies has got an impact on the performance of the organization, then in that case we have to see whether from how many employees can we get the feedback, because again, ideally IT industry is a big industry, let's say in Pakistan, and in this case we cannot get the response from each and every employee in this case. So in order to follow up that model, we can say that we have to go ahead with different sampling techniques, because this is already classified that the whole population cannot be measured. So you have to go after the samples, but what kind of samples which we can go through. We have already discussed previously that there are basically two types of samples which we can pursue. First type is non-probability sampling. We have discussed already that there are two types, like judgment and convenience sampling, and then there is probability sampling. The probability sampling comprises of four types. We know about that, and then they are termed as simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. Now, as far as non-probability sampling is concerned, we know that this type of sampling is normally termed as biased. So in this case, for example, we have to choose a sample by judgment. For example, in an IT sector company, I'm just trying to find out an employee by my own choice, and in this case I can be biased. So by my own judgment or by my own convenience, I can end up with employees who can give biased remarks. So comparing this thing with the probability sampling, there are less chances of biasness from researcher, and in this case simple random sampling is one such type. So this is just a slide which we have discussed before regarding convenience sampling, and we know very well that items or the employees or the respondents are selected through convenience. Then likewise, judgment sampling comprises of your own judgment and your selection of experts. Now coming to the probability sampling, we come to the simple random type. And in this case, you see the main thing of vital importance is development of a sampling frame, because you list all employees of a firm from which you want to select the sample, and once you have devised the sampling frame, which comprises of the list of all employees, then you can randomly select from this list. So every employee has got an equal chance from that list to be selected. Now that is kind of unbiased, and researchers' interference is minimal. You can just feed the list in a software and ask the software to select these I would say respondents randomly. It's up to you that you can do it manually as well by using formulas. So then there is a type comprising of the replacement and without replacement, because in replacement we know that once one employee is selected, then in a replacement case he can be selected twice or thrice, maybe more. But sampling without replacement comprises of selection of employees in which there is very little, I would say that there is no chance of him being selected again. That's why it's called without replacement. So then you can get these samples from a number of options as we discussed before. Here you can see the examples of various items. In this case we have just listed the item number, and in this case we can just randomly select. Now coming to systematic sampling, first step is that we just determine the sample size, and then we divide the frame of number of individuals into number of groups which you want to select, and once the group is selected, then you can easily determine the k times individual, which is already seen on the screen, and in this case then you can do systematic sampling by selecting the individual after a certain span, after a certain number of individuals, and so in this case we go for systematic sampling. Now coming to stratified sampling, in this case we have to determine a certain criteria, and it's a more logical form. For example, we just want to select the whole population in terms of gender, and so we select a certain frame based on male or female. Once we have done that, then we want to know that, or we want to reduce the whole lining by first more reducing the case in the fact like that we have to see whether there are certain individuals who are having a certain income. So certain, I would say a certain another criteria is induced in this case, in which we are focusing on the number of individuals having a certain income. So this is a second layer of strata. So we can have a number of layers in that population, and based on that, based on the selection of those layers, a sample can be extracted based on certain criteria, which is not dependent upon researcher choice. It is dependent upon the criteria which are unbiased. So here this is most common technique which is used, and you can see that here we can select various stratas. Now coming to the next part is the cluster sample. Here the population is divided into certain clusters, and we can randomly choose these clusters as well. Now in this case one thing is for sure, that the population size is too large when we use this cluster sampling, and here basically equal number of groups are made, and in this case you can just see that we have to randomly choose these clusters, and they are representative of the population in this case. However, certain criteria normally are not used. We just divide the population and then use certain clusters or select certain groups. Coming to the comparison, well, there are certain advantages, disadvantages as well. We know that random sampling is easy to use, and again, however, it may not be representing the population that effectively, but comparing that with stratified sampling, it's a logical reasoning through which we select the sample, and based on that logical reasoning we select certain respondents. So yes, it's quite unbiased and more unbiased as compared to simple random sampling or systematic sampling. Coming to the cluster sampling, it's quite cost effective, but it is very less efficient as compared to all the other sample types which we have discussed before. But this is only applicable in case of very large population, and we need a larger sample in this case as well. So we have discussed about the survey. Now survey is the most common technique which is used for getting the response of the individuals in any organization or any kind of study which we are pursuing. Now basically it's the common tool used in business administration, and we have to evaluate the importance of that survey. So the first question does arise, that what is the purpose of that survey? And in this case, let's say we have discussed before that, let's say we want to determine the leadership characteristic, whether we want to know whether leadership is effective in producing organizational results. So in this case we want to have a survey of the various aspects of leadership in the organization, and once we have focused on that, then we develop the purpose of that survey based on this thing. Now is the survey based on a probability sample? Then again it depends, because probability sampling is most authentic one as compared to non-probability sampling. Then coverage error, well, these are the various errors which are discussed, and you see, despite the fact that no matter how much we are unbiased, there are certain errors which we do face in a survey. First here is coverage error, second is non-response error, then measurement error, and sampling error in this case. So in this case, coverage error, whether there is an appropriate frame or not, we will discuss it right now in the next slide. Then non-response error, whether we are following up or not, and whether there are good questions which really represent the required, I would say, variable, and then sampling error. Now coming to the coverage error and its details, that what is coverage error. In this case, you see, whenever we are selecting a sample, whether it's through probability sampling or non-probability sampling, there is always a chance that, and always there's a possibility that we would ignore certain groups, we would ignore other respondents, and no matter how sure we are that that specific sample is a representative of that population, there is certain percent of population which we are ignoring, and because of that we would not be able to cover that specific opinion from that specific cohort. So coming to the next one, non-response error. Now people who do not respond may be different from those who do respond. You see, we have discussed previously that let's say in a questionnaire which we have posed in front of a specific audience or respondents, and in those questionnaires some questions are filled and some questions are not answered. Now in that case this is a non-response error, because in some questions either the respondent was hesitant, he was not willing to answer those questions, and he was reluctant to answer that. So that does create some kind of non-response bias or error. And in order to avoid that, one technique which is very commonly used is that, let's say there's a population of 2,000 employees which need to cover in a specific study, and in this case the sample size which has been determined by a sampling formula or a sampling calculator is 400 employees. So it is advisable that we distribute 500 to 600 questionnaire in the organization, because it is already classified that a certain percentage of questionnaires would come uncompleted and some questions would not be answered. So we do ensure that there's a certain gap, there's certain slack which is there for such kind of questionnaires which are not properly filled. So in that case, those incomplete questionnaires are then discarded. They are not used because their analysis can create certain problems. Coming to next one, sampling error. Now, this error cannot be avoided. It will always be there. Reason that you see, let's say from those 2,000 employees in that specific firm, we take a sample of 300. Now we take another sample of 300 other than those 300 employees which we have already taken. Now these samples will always differ. There is always highly likely that these samples will always differ in this case. So this difference always creates sampling error. Coming to the next one is measurement error. You see, this is related to the questionnaire flaws, because let's say you are asking irrelevant questions which are not much related to leadership in that specific organization, then such a kind of questions will measure the leadership characteristic incorrectly. So once that variable is measured incorrectly, then your whole variable calculation is wrong, your analysis will also be incorrect. So this is one kind of error which is present in the questionnaire. Then the second kind of measurement error is related to respondent. He may not be able to correctly assess that question. He may not be able to perceive the question which is being asked. He may think that this question is basically asked about some other phenomena, and the problem may lie with the wording of the question in that questionnaire. So measurement error basically deals with the fact that the wording of the questionnaire is focused or not, whether the respondent's feeling towards that question is or that question is all right or not. So basically these errors, like which we have discussed, like coverage, non-response, and sampling and measurement error, these are various errors which we have to face while conducting a survey. These errors can be minimized, but then it should be kept in mind that they cannot be completely eliminated. So we try to reduce these survey errors, and you see diagrammatically in this case you can see on the screen that coverage error in the whole population, yes, there is a certain group which you can see which can be excluded and which will be excluded. And likewise non-response error, again there are certain questions in which there is no response, we do follow up on those responses. We try to intimate the respondents again and again that, look, you have not answered the full questionnaire, so can you answer those questions again for us, or in this case. So we do the follow-up, but technically speaking, this is one debate among business administrative officials, that once you do a follow-up, then that questionnaire will not be unbiased, because second time when a respondent is answering that question, he may have second thoughts. So once a questionnaire is not filled completely in the first go, then that questionnaire can pose a lot of significant problems in their analysis, because according to the research and business philosophers, second time or even third time follow-up can have the response which may not be representative of real respondent feelings. So that's why, as we have discussed before, we try to avoid that by giving questionnaires or distributing questionnaires number which is more than the original sample size which has been calculated from the population in this case. So coming to sampling error, here again there are differences from which exist between all the samples. That is why that statistically or quantitatively, whenever we are applying an analysis, it is advisable that you select one kind of sample of, let's say, 100 or whatever the sample size is from one population, and then you extract a second sample from the same population and run the same analysis again in order to check the validity of those statistical results, which will be taken from that whole analysis part. Then, as you can see in the diagram, measurement error can lead to bad or misleading question. So this is the one facet of this error, because yes, you are portraying a question which is wrongly put, and you can portray a question which can offend the respondent as well. So badly worded question, or a question which offends the respondent, or a question which may feel the respondent sensitive towards the question which is being answered, then again you are not correctly portraying the type of question you want to ask from the respondent. So all these errors come under measurement error in this case. So then once we have gone through these errors which we face in all these kind of surveys which we might be conducting for to analyze this, then comes the fact that how to, once we have measured all these variables, then how to organize them, how to visualize them. But before going ahead with that, you see, we must know that the data which is collected has got two uses. First is that you can say so that from research aspect, we are trying to validate certain theory, which then is more related to the research side, and for that purpose we have got these models. But the other aspect is the practical application side, because practically whenever a boss in an organization wants to know about the feedback of certain phenomena which is introduced in the organization, and he wants to know whether that policy is working or not. So instead of portraying your opinion in that forum, the most effective way to know the impact of that specific policy is to first quantify all the tangible and intangible aspects of that fact, and then ultimately measure that quantitatively. So this is very important, that these two aspects, the two aspects of, or the two I would say that ways of using such kind of analysis is kept in view. One is that you just look at the theoretical side. We want to just test a specific theory which is produced in more theoretical terms in the research of that specific business phenomena, but that's pure research side. But in organizational side, this is vital that practical application of that phenomena is observed. So the manager would want to know the impact of certain policy or impact of certain phenomena, and in order to do that, we need to analyze the whole situation by measuring all the tangible and intangible factors in that specific case. Now, in this case, one big example is balanced scorecard, which is now commonly used. And you see, this creation of balanced scorecard is acknowledgement of the fact that we have to quantify the strategies, we have to quantify the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and then to find and to first measure those phenomena. Once we have measured those phenomena, then this is vital that we basically analyze them to have some figure, some tangible output through which we can compare the previous and past performance with the current one, and we should have some concrete figures which could tell us in which direction to go and which strategy is more successful, which policy is more successful or not. So in order to even use and to see that your business strategy is working in the organization, this is vital that all these inquantifiable phenomena be measured, tackled, and then analyzed to make the final decision from practical point of view as well. So in order to do that, once we have gone through the basics of the survey and the techniques which are used to measure these intangible things, then we go ahead with the organization and visualization of these variables. For example, in this case, we hypothetically discussed that how to find the impact of leadership on the performance of individual. So once we have developed, let's say, 5 questions which will be used to measure the leadership in that specific organization, then question is that how to organize this specific variable, how to visualize that. So coming to this thing, coming to very basics, that categorical data, as we have discussed before, comprises of basically one category variable, then 2 categorical variables. These are just ways to basically represent the data. And in this case, you see, we know that in categorical data, we basically deal with the nominal variables. For example, whether the participant is male or female, or whether he is working or self-employed. So all such kind of questions come under categorical data in this case. So coming to this part, we have to see in this case whether and how we represent these data in this case. You see, in this case, you can see that summary table is one tool which is used. Now this is one of the very basics in which we just summarize the whole information in summary table, and you can see this here. This is just one example. In this case, summary table is made. Now this is one question which we have asked regarding the reason for shopping online. Now in this case, there was 37% respondents which said that better reasons for shopping online were better prices. So what we have done is that we just asked their opinion here, and we just converted them into percentages, and in these percentages we just put them in one summary table, which you can see. So in this case, then you must keep in mind that we are making summary table for each question. However, in reality, let's say what the practical example which we discussed, we would be asking many questions regarding one variable, and one way of displaying information regarding that variable is giving a summary table of each question. This can be done in that way as well, but normally such type, more now sophisticated type, is being used to display the data in this case. Likewise, previously, as we have discussed, that there are two categorical variables as well, and in this case we use contingency table. Now coming to contingency table, here as you can see, this is used to study the various patterns, and that can be existing, and we can use cross tabulation as well in this case. Again, for two variables, we definitely use rows and columns. In this case, we will discuss a detailed example ahead in this case of how to use these contingency tables and how to use these summary tables. Summary table, as we have discussed before, is very much evident in this case. So coming to the next part here, this is one example of contingency table. Here we have determined the sample of 400 invoices. Now again, we have divided these invoices into different categories like small, medium and large. Now this is one category, but however, each invoice is again classified under two main categories, which are comprising of no errors and errors. So basically we are giving information regarding two dimensions of invoices of the sample which we have withdrawn. Now in contingency table, you can very much see that both dimensions can be displayed effectively in this kind of contingency table, and then again we will discuss in detail how to draw these contingency tables in softwares in this case. So again, one other effective way of displaying the same information is in the form of percentages, because the primarily usage of a contingency table is to compare various figures. So in this case, while we are comparing various figures, then it is very much advisable that we use percentages, because percentages are most effective way of comparing information. Here you can very much see that the same information which has been portrayed in simple numbers is being shown in percentages. For example, small amount here in which we were showing the total number of 170, and as compared to the total of 190 is now being shown in terms of percentages here as 42.5%. As you can see that we have just computed the whole thing with the total number of invoices in this case. So likewise, all the invoices have been calculated in percentage wise. So percentage, whenever you are making business analysis in a report in your organization, then it's more advisable to portray percentages in this form instead of giving original numbers, because the managerial panel or the audience or the person in front of whom this whole report is presented is basically seeing these contingency tables in order to compare 2 or 3 or any number of entities which are being displayed. So a percentage is the most effective type here. Similarly here, this is another way here in which we have shown percentage in terms of rows. Previously, you can see that we have presented percentage in terms of overall figure, which is 400. So we calculated the percentage of each error from based on taking the total figure here, which is presented in terms of total number of invoices. However, the next part is regarding row-wise, taking row-wise total and then taking percentage from that perspective. So you see, this is just a way of displaying the information from different aspects, because you can display percentage from many aspects in this case. Again, here, but this must be kept into view, that taking, for example, percentage from different aspects reveals different kind of information. So the main point is that the more different ways in which you can present contingency table, the more different kind of results and different kind of information will be displayed to you. And maybe in that case, many hidden aspects can be displayed in front of you, which under normal circumstances may not be displayed to you in one kind of contingency table. So that's the beauty of contingency table here, because you can even portray and disclose many hidden factors which may not be evident normally, but if you portray those information from different ways of analyzing the same contingency table, then you may detect many anomalies, many errors, or many vital information which may not be present there at the first place. So here percentage of row totals is evident. Then the same information is being presented column wise, and here in this case you can see that we have just taken the same information by taking the percentage column wise and taking number of no error as a standard way of basically capitalizing the main information. Here the same information is being portrayed differently. So likewise you can see the same medium amount portrays that there is 61.54% chance that invoices with errors are medium size. Now if you compare it with the information previously on previous slides, it's different. And you see, that's the thing which we focus on when we are presenting managerial information in this case. So again, keeping in view, the main point is that contingency tables can be displayed in many different ways, and each way can show additional information. So then coming to the next part, this does show another way of organization of numerical data, and this can display some vital information as well. And in this case, the numerical data comprises of ordered array, frequency distribution and cumulative distribution. So in today's lecture, what we discussed about was the practical application of quantitative analysis subject, how in present arena the intangible phenomena are converted into measurable form, how they are then analyzed, what are the different phases through which the intangible phenomena which have been considered vital for success of organizations are measured, first converted into model form, and then measured and then analyzed in this case. So once we know about these phenomena, then where is our subject dealing with this whole phase of analyzing the whole thing? So we went through the details of that, and we took some hypothetical examples, for example leadership and selection or other practices which are existing in an organization. Similarly, then we discussed about the various sampling types which are vital for selection techniques in a population, as ideally it's not possible to take the whole population, and which sampling techniques are better and which are not, which sampling techniques are more efficient, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of these sampling techniques. Now similarly, we went ahead with the various survey errors, and survey, as it is the most common form being pursued in business research, therefore what are the errors which we face while performing these surveys. And once we have gone through that, then the organization of these variables, because once we have measured the data, we have organized that data, then these variables need visualization and organization in proper form so that they can be easily sorted out. So there are different ways which we discussed, and in this case we discussed the summary table, which is one form commonly used, and the contingency table in this case, and how it is used and what are the different forms through which the same information can be portrayed in different ways effectively, which can give us some missing links in the vital information which is hidden in the typical data which has been retrieved from various organizational phenomena. So these were the basic facts which we discussed in this lecture today. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.